Welcome, I'm Nina Griffin and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. Today we'll talk about the Cancer Ingress, the first day of summer, set for Washington, D.C., so primarily impacting the United States. Even if you are interested in the Cancer Ingress for other countries, this might be an interesting video for you because some of the same placements will apply regardless of where you are in the world. All right, first I wanted to say thank you to all of my patrons. I appreciate all of your support and encouragement. I am looking forward to doing more videos as summer jumps into gear, so let's get started. All right, so if you're not familiar with ingresses, very quickly, there are 4 cardinal ingresses every year. The ingress is the moment that the sun enters the first minute of each of the cardinal signs, Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. Each of these signs also rules each of the seasons. Aries rules spring, Cancer rules summer, and so on. So every time that a season starts, we get a cardinal ingress. And then we set that chart for usually the capital of the country that we're investigating to better understand the kinds of trends that the chart forecasts for that location or for that country. If you live in a really large country like the US, and for example, like me, you live on the West Coast, you can also run a Cancer ingress for your location to get a sense of how the larger trends that are forecast by the Washington, D.C. chart might manifest in your particular area. So first, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about the 2021 Aries ingress. This is the chart that is set for the first moment of spring, and it's right here. You can look at it. This is set for Washington, D.C. And not only does this chart forecast the trends for spring of a particular year in that location or in that country, it also gives us an overview of the entire 12 months. Because the first day of spring is the beginning of the astrological new year, this chart actually covers the year in its entirety. What we do then is once we've gotten a chance to look at the Aries ingress, we then see how the subsequent ingresses interact with this chart to get a better sense of how the potentials that are mentioned or shown in that Aries chart are going to be brought into being during subsequent seasons and during subsequent cardinal ingresses. So, for example, I think this Aries ingress is very positive. We are one of the very few places in the world that have an angular Jupiter this year. So the US and Canada got very, very lucky. And I think that this reflects the fact that both of these countries, have a strong vaccine campaign, and then therefore, as a result, we get much less of a COVID wave than in 2020, like many countries did then. Now, if you look at this horoscope, I think it's worth kind of examining it a little bit because we're going to come back to it later on. We look at something called the ruler of the year. Now, the ruler of the year is a planet that usually it's either the planet that is on the ascendant or on the midheaven if there is one. And if there isn't one, we always look at the planet that has the most dignities in the degree rising. So in this case, we have both, right? We have a planet that's right on the ascendant, and that's Jupiter in Aquarius. But of course, there's a planet that rules the ascendant as well, and that's going to be Saturn. So I think this year, the best way to look at it is we have sort of 2 co-rulers of the year. Now, the ruler of the year is said to describe what happens to the people of a country in a given year. So the overall mood, is the mood fearful? Is it happy? Is it cautious? Is it angry? What's the general tenor of the vibe, right? But also, it tells us what's going on in the country as a whole. When we have two rulers of the year, we can look at them as modifying each other, right? They're both applicable. They're both going to come out at different times. And we have to look at both of them in subsequent ingresses. So in the Aries ingress, we can see that we've got Jupiter in Aquarius on the ascendant, which is very positive, right? The overall mood of the country is, it's quite upbeat, it's quite positive. There is a lot of optimism, there's a lot of generosity. I think there's also a lot of money chasing things, which is how you get, inflation, how you get a rise in prices, things like that, right? But generally, it's a very positive and a very healing placement to have. I mean, that's really what you would want to see at the end of a pandemic, right? This is the thing that it's kind of like manna from heaven. Now, of course, at the same time, we have to look at Saturn, and that tells a different story, which is also quite true. It tells us that we have a nation that has been in many ways very traumatized by the past year, and it's also, a planet of fear. So Saturn shows us that even though Jupiter wants to be optimistic and he wants to get out there, Saturn shows there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, as well as a lot of maybe things like chronic illness, all those things that have to do with Saturn that are present in the population. Now, I think this Aries ingress is very interesting because we can see that the ruler of the sixth house of disease, which of course we're all watching very carefully, is the moon in Gemini. Now it's separating from a conjunction with Mars, which is positive, right? It tells us that the intensity, that the virulence of COVID seems to be decreasing this year compared to the past, right? The moon is drawing away from this very inflammatory Mars. Interestingly, the fourth house where the moon and Mars are placed rules the lungs in traditional astrology. And so to have the moon going away from Mars generally shows, you know, the nation's lungs are a little bit less beat up and afflicted this year. However, the moon is still with Mars generally, right? It's still, they are in conjunction, even though it's a separating and wide conjunction. So there's still a sense here that people are angry. People want to sort of break things up. There's a tendency to want to move, for example. Mars has a lot to do with moving and separations. You know, nobody's really wanting to be investing into relationships. They're sort of like wanting to break away. They're asserting their independence, if you will. So that's part of the vibe. Now, the moon, as you can see, is applying to trine Jupiter, and that is helpful. So even though there is this urge to kind of be free and so, you know, tell people what's what, you can still see that the moon applying to Jupiter generally gives a more positive and beneficent influence to the nation's mood this year. So overall, this chart is about as good as it gets, given the placements that are here. Now, let's take a look at the Cancer ingress. So this Cancer ingress became effective in Washington, D.C., June 20th, 11:32 p.m. local time. Now, as you can see, the same degree rises as with the Aries ingress. And what that tells us is that the same kind of themes that we saw in the Aries ingress are going to be especially prominent this summer. It's kind of like the Cancer ingress brings to fruition the promise brought out in the Aries ingress. Now, what's different in this chart is that Jupiter is no longer exactly conjunct the ascendant, although it is still in the ascendant, and it is exactly stationing retrograde. Now, Jupiter is in Pisces, so there is this overall sense that, you know, boundaries have now dissolved, right? Jupiter is in his own domicile in Pisces. Because Jupiter is in a sign of Jupiter, it's all very, everything's very kind of open, no barriers, you know, there is a certain kind of porousness to everything. Now, Saturn, of course, is still Lord of the Year, and he is still ruler of the ascendant in the Cancer ingress. So there's still this sense that, you know, we know that there are some limits somewhere, but we don't maybe have a clear sense of where they are, of what they are. What do we need to worry about? You know, what is the real thing to worry about? That said, both of these planets describe how people are currently feeling, right? So there's a lot of optimism and excitement on the one hand, but there is still a lot of fear, anxiety, and buried trauma, right? Saturn in the 12th on the other. So the other thing to think about too is the 12th house does rule isolation. And so there could be a lot of people who are still sort of like isolating, or people generally, you know, some people want to go out, but some people are more comfortable staying at home, right? Now, what I thought was really interesting about this Cancer ingress is the fact that we have a benefic and a malefic planet in the sixth house of disease. So on the one hand, we've got Venus right on the sixth house cusp in Cancer, and this is quite positive, right? This is a very nice thing to see because it tells us, hey, there's a real potential here for healing. There's a potential here for keeping infections low. You know, anytime you see a benefic who's not too badly behaved in the sixth house, it's a good sign in terms of getting disease numbers down. However, we also have this very inflammatory Mars in Leo, right in the sixth. So there's almost a sense of bifurcation, right? Like some people are doing very well health-wise, but there's a segment of the population, maybe people who couldn't or wouldn't get the vaccine, where the virus just seems to be raging. And so I think that's what we're going to see. We're going to see this really interesting separation into two groups here, right? Depending on where you are, you're going to have either a Venus experience or a Mars experience. And notice that that Mars in Leo also opposes Saturn, right? So this is something that's still afflicting the people, or at least part of the population. It may be happening in a hidden way or in a slow way because Mars and Saturn are cadent. So often things that are cadent happen out of sight, right? They're happening sort of outside of our line of vision, if you will, but they're still present. The other thing I noticed is that the ruler of the sixth house is the moon, and it is in its fall, it's in Scorpio, conjoining the ninth house. So rightly or wrongly, I think there is the perception, and to some extent the reality, the COVID epidemic or pandemic is something that's happening abroad. And in many cases that is true, right? The United States is doing pretty well compared to a lot of other countries who don't have the vaccine or who've had a lot more outbreaks this year, like India and so on. So for the time being, it seems like the action, if you will, is sort of in foreign countries, right? That's the case this summer. However, you can see there is still the slow fire burning, which is Mars and Leo. So I think there is definitely a sense that we're going to have more freedom, and I think a sense of kind of relief and release in many ways. But we're not exactly out of the woods fully, right? Emotionally or in terms of actual infections. You will notice that the moon's next aspect is going to be a square to Saturn. So there is still a sense, and this is something that's true worldwide, because of course the planets' placements in the zodiac are the same everywhere in the Cancer Ingress in the world. There is still a sense of fear, of anxiety, of isolation, and of loss, right? All of those things that are associated with Saturn. Again, because they are cadent in this chart, they're generally sort of pushed to the side, and they could be seen as happening to other people rather than to ourselves. But it's one of those things that could be happening more for many people subconsciously. They're just not really sort of owning the experience. All right, so then if you look at the two charts, I just created a bi-wheel. On the inside, we've got the Aries ingress. On the outside, we've got the Cancer ingress. And you can see that we've got the same degree rising, 21 Aquarius. But what I thought was interesting too is that the Cancer ingress has Jupiter in Pisces closely conjoining Mercury in Pisces of the Aries ingress. And I think this is very interesting because I think this speaks to some extent of maybe potential for self-delusion, for being overly optimistic, right? Mercury in Pisces is very debilitated. And so to have Jupiter in Pisces conjoining it, it's kind of like, you are deluded, maybe you're lucky in many ways, right? Like you don't have to know the truth because you're fortunate, but at the same time, there is a sense that we don't see the full picture right now. Maybe we're being overly positive in some ways. And again, this could have to do not just with COVID, but it could have to do with other matters, right? Politics, finance, all sorts of things like that. I also noted that Mercury in Gemini in the Cancer ingress closely conjoins the moon and, to a lesser degree, Mars in the Aries ingress. So I think there's a real sense here of a very harsh speech, of divisive speech, because of course Mercury does have to do with the communication, with the messaging that's happening. And if that Moon-Mars conjunction is being activated in the Cancer ingress, we are going to see quite a bit of back and forth, quite a bit of, verbal trickery, all those things that are associated with Mercury. Mars brings a sort of aggressive, inciting kind of flavor to that speech. I also noticed that Venus, who is at 22 degrees Cancer in the Cancer ingress, is exactly conjunct the sixth house cusp of the Aries ingress as well, which is very positive, right? It tells us that, yes, the progress that the US has made in beating the pandemic is real, and it's something that we can, to some extent at least, rely on this summer. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video. My name is Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel.